No matter how many soldiers and pieces of equipment his military loses, Russian President Vladimir Putin won't stop his assaults. Zaporizhzhia is one of his biggest targets, and it has been since the summer. Russia failed to take the ground Putin wanted during a massive summer assault, meaning Putin now has until the end of the fall to launch major attacks. And on October 20th, he did just that. Targeting a small village on the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia, Russia unleashed a huge mechanized assault designed to crush Ukraine's defenses. It didn't work. Putin's massive assault at Zaporizhzhia has exploded into chaos, leaving Russia dealing with yet another unexpected defeat. On October 21st, Kyiv Post reported that Russia had attempted to launch a large assault against the village of Machka just a day earlier. That report came directly from Ukrainian military officials, who also said that Ukraine did what it has done to so many of Russia's mechanized assaults in recent months, stopped it in its tracks. Russia had clearly been preparing to take Machka for a while. Its assault was well organized, and if Ukraine hadn't been prepared for it, it might have been enough to take the village. The Russian attack came in multiple waves, most of which appeared to belong to Russia's 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment. The troops advanced from the villages of Verbova and Novoprokopivka, the Kyiv Post reports. This suggests that Russia was attempting to combine its wave-based assaults with an approach from two directions, perhaps hoping to complete a pincer movement against Ukraine. Whatever the intention may have been, the assault didn't work. Each of the Russian waves consisted of between 5 and 8 armored vehicles, the Kyiv Post adds. This is a reversion to type for Russia. During the summer, it had switched to assault tactics that relied more on small groups of infiltrators than they did on mechanized assaults using armored vehicles. This change in tactical direction was reported by RBC Ukraine in July. Often, Russian groups were as small as 3 or 4 soldiers who were tasked with advancing and penetrating into Ukrainian positions without being noticed. Mechanized units were too large, the theory seemed to be. Armored vehicles make for big targets for Ukraine's drones and artillery. The Kyiv Post continues, noting that Russia ultimately ended up deploying a rough total of 26 mechanized units, including infantry fighting vehicles and armored fighting vehicles that included its Tiger. Also known as the Tiger M, this vehicle can carry up to 10 soldiers and is armed with both a grenade launcher and a light machine gun, Army recognition reports. It can reach a maximum speed between 77 and 87 miles per hour, depending on the specific model, and it has an impressive 621-mile range. All solid specs that should make it a good choice for conducting an assault on a village, but those specifications weren't enough to save the Tiger, or Russia's other armored vehicles, from Ukraine's defenses. Based on the numbers the Kyiv Post shares, we can assume that Russia launched between 3 and 5 waves based on the approximation of 5 to 8 vehicles per wave. This wave-based approach had been the Russian tactic for much of the war before it switched to its smaller units. The first couple of waves are essentially kamikaze assaults designed to drain Ukraine's ammunition, leaving it vulnerable to follow-up waves. Of course, the limitation of these wave assaults is always the number of vehicles that Russia has available. Once those vehicles run out, which is likely to happen unless Ukraine burns through its stockpiles of drones and ammunition, the assault fails. Ukraine knows this, and it was ready for what Russia attempted to do at Machka. The country's 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade caught the Russian forces as they attempted to make their advance, with soldiers from the brigade claiming that they struck back quickly. Using artillery, first-person view or FPV drones, and other unmanned aerial vehicles, Ukraine's defenders targeted Russia's positions. Ukraine also took a page out of Russia's book by deploying Soviet-era T-72 tanks into the fight. It's unknown if these tanks came from Ukraine's stockpiles or if they're being captured from Russia, but Ukraine used them to great effect. The T-72s engaged Russia's armored vehicles and infantry directly as the drones flew and the artillery shells exploded. Plus, there were mines. Several of Russia's armored vehicles ran afoul of explosives from below while trying to escape the drones flying above. To counter any attempt by Russia to claim the Machka assault was more successful than it actually was, the 118th Brigade also shared a video of its response to the attack in a Facebook reel. Lasting a little over 3 minutes, the video highlights many of the techniques Ukraine used to take out the Russian occupiers. Set against the backdrop of thumping music, the footage shows Russian vehicles being struck by FPV drones, leaving trails of smoke and crippled metal in their wake. Some of the vehicles managed to keep moving after being hit for the first time, but that only leads to follow-up strikes by more drones. In one piece of footage, we see the view from one FPV drone as another scores a direct hit on a Russian vehicle. The vehicle doesn't stop, so the drone recording the footage draws in closer. Eventually, we see that the vehicle has what appears to be barbed wire strapped to it, which is what has become known as a cope cage. Cope cages are improvised pieces of armor that both Russia and Ukraine strap to their tanks and armored vehicles. The idea is to provide armor for the armor. In a war where drones can descend from above to tackle a vehicle's weak points, with anti-tank munitions doing the same, a cope cage is supposed to trigger an early explosion and bear the brunt of the firepower, leaving the vehicle below safe to continue its advance. The Russian cope cage may have worked against Ukraine's first drone. The second scores a direct hit on the side of the vehicle. And so it goes in the video. Time and time again, we see FPV drones either recording other strikes or recording hits on Russia's vehicles. The situation in this direction is under control. No position has been lost, the text accompanying the video declares. The Kyiv Post offers another quote from Ukraine's troops, which added, "The enemy suffered significant losses. Personnel and armored vehicles were destroyed. We are working in a coordinated and decisive manner." Russia's assault ended up not being an assault at all. It was a massacre of metal machines that Russia still seems unable to protect against Ukraine's drones and other weapons. Euromaidan Press reports the scale of the losses, and they're huge. Of the 26 armored units the Kyiv Post says Russia deployed, 22 were either destroyed or otherwise lost to Ukraine's counterattack. Among them were 12 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 Tigers and 6 armored personnel carriers. Presumably, many of these vehicles would have been carrying troops, meaning it's not just armor that Russia lost on its ill-fated attempt to take Malotokmachka. We'll have lost soldiers too, potentially dozens, though Ukraine doesn't reveal the full scale of the casualties. This latest Ukrainian victory comes at a key time for several reasons, not least of which is that Russia has launched a renewed offensive on Zaporizhzhia following the abject failure of the summer offensive. That offensive began toward the end of summer. On August 18th, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, reported that Russia has diverted troops previously operating in the Sumy region to Zaporizhzhia. That alone was an admission of summer failure. Russia has been launching attacks in Sumy since May with the intention of creating a buffer zone intended to protect its vulnerable border regions. The Sumy offensive failed, and it looks like Russia diverted many of the survivors or reserves it had in the region to another area of Ukraine where it thought they might have more luck. That regrouping was confirmed a few days later, but Russia's summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia still failed. Still, the troop deployment meant that Russia was prepared to launch more assaults in the fall, which is precisely what we saw on October 20th. By September, Syrsky was reporting that Russia holds a 3-hold advantage in both manpower and equipment in most regions of Zaporizhzhia. That advantage extends to between 4 and 6 times the number of soldiers and equipment Ukraine can deploy in some areas, Syrsky added. This is Russia's strategy in a nutshell, and we saw what that numerical advantage can mean in the assault on Malotokmachka. Russia can afford to deploy and lose so many mechanized units because it has others it can send in future waves. At least it has them right now. In Zaporizhzhia, much will depend on Ukraine's drone and ammunition stockpiles. Russia's armor is vulnerable. The question is whether it's so numerous that Russia will be able to overcome this vulnerability with sheer numbers alone. Right now, the defense is holding. Toward the end of summer, Russia had planned several large-scale offensives in Zaporizhzhia. However, Ukraine managed to stall those offensives before they began, the Kyiv Post reports. Russia decided to divert troops, including elite marine units, to Donetsk, likely in an attempt to push on into Pokrovsk. The assaults on Zaporizhzhia slowed down, though they were still plentiful. In fact, the month when the Russian military made maximum efforts to break through became a month of relatively small territorial gains, Syrsky said back in August. Perhaps the offensives Russia is launching in the fall are the assaults it was supposed to launch in the summer. Ukraine is still defending, and as October 20th proved, it has more than enough skill and firepower to destroy Russia's armor before it can make any real dent in Ukraine's defenses. Still, armor isn't the only thing that Ukraine has to worry about in Zaporizhzhia. Drones are also causing major issues. On October 22nd, just a couple of days after Russia launched its failed mechanized assault on Malotokmachka, yet another horde of Russia's long-range drones was launched at Zaporizhzhia. UKR Inform was among the first outlets to report on the strike, noting that 5 people had been injured during Russia's attack. Russia doesn't discriminate when it comes to the ages of the Ukrainian civilians that it targets. The youngest was 21, with the eldest being 62. Shrapnel wounds and carbon monoxide poisoning were among the initial injuries being reported. We say initial because the true injury toll ended up being much worse. A few hours after UKR Inform's report, Pravda issued a follow-up, stating that the injury toll in Zaporizhzhia had risen to 15. As of this latest report, 3 children have been added to the list of victims of Russia's long-range drones. 2 of those children are infants, one aged 7 months and the other 6 months. The other is a 13-year-old boy. We mentioned earlier that the mechanized assault on Malotokmachka demonstrates Russia reverting to tactics that it had used constantly before the summer. With these drone strikes, Russia continues to do something that it's done from the moment the Ukraine war started: terrorize Ukraine's civilians. Action on Armed Violence provides the numbers as of October 17th. It reports that there have been 10,309 incidents affecting Ukraine's civilians, leading to 42,569 casualties. Of those casualties, 33,372 civilians have been injured, and 9,297 have died as a result of their wounds. Air-launched weapons like the drones Russia used to target Zaporizhzhia on October 21st and into October 22nd have been responsible for 29% of all civilian deaths reported since Putin launched his invasion. Zaporizhzhia is also one of the 5 most impacted regions when it comes to Russia's attacks on civilians, having recorded 2,917 casualties as of October 17th. This most recent drone strike raises that number by 15. And it also shows us that Russia is getting desperate in Zaporizhzhia. It's now combining mechanized assaults that it knows are likely to fail, costing it valuable equipment and soldiers in the process, with a concerted campaign of terror against the region's civilians. Russia is getting desperate, and what we're now seeing is its attempts to make up for the outright flop that was the country's summer offensive against Ukraine. We've touched on this failure already, but we haven't highlighted just how massive that failure was or how much damage it's done to Russia. On September 2nd, the Atlantic Council published an article that summed up the impact the failed summer offensive had on Russia. It declares that this one failure shatters the myth of inevitable Russian victory that will sting Putin. The idea of the summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia and elsewhere was for Russia to unleash a force so overwhelming that Ukraine wouldn't be able to stop it. Russia would advance at pace, snatching up massive amounts of territory, and when it was all over, Putin would be able to enter peace negotiations with more leverage than he's had at any point during the war. "Look at how much territory we took during the summer," Putin would have been able to say. "Cede that territory to Russia, or we will take the rest of Ukraine." Putin himself was so confident in the summer offensive that he claimed, "There are reasons to believe we can finish off Ukraine back in March." The outcome of the offensive was not what Putin had in mind, as the Atlantic Council notes. The Russian army has been unable to secure any frontline breakthroughs or capture a single major city, with overall Russian advances during the 3 summer months limited to an estimated 0.3% of Ukrainian territory. Crucially, key strategic objectives like Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine remain in Ukrainian hands, it reported in September. Not a lot has changed as we approach the end of October. Any hope that Putin had of using Russia's summer gains as leverage to obtain the peace that he wanted has evaporated into thin air. By the end of the summer, Putin had a staggering 210,000 casualties on his hands for all of 2025 and very little to show for it. You can learn more about how devastating this offensive ended up being for Russia in our video covering the full scale of Russia's losses in 2025. All of this brings us back to Mala Tokmachka and the renewed drone assaults on Zaporizhzhia. What Ukraine is dealing with now is a Russia that is beyond desperate. Having failed to achieve its summer objectives, the country is now throwing everything that it has left at Ukraine before the winter cold makes serious ground-based advances far more difficult. The armor Russia unleashed in the Mala Tokmachka direction would likely have been the armor Russia wanted to keep, perhaps ready for future assaults once winter passed. Instead, much of it is now burned out on the field and roads surrounding a small village that Russia failed to take. As for the drones, that's all that Russia really has left to do any serious damage in Zaporizhzhia. Unable to gain the ground that it wants, Russia is leaning even more heavily on its terror tactics. That's according to the New Voice of Ukraine, which said in September that Russia is focusing on improving its tactical position rather than making any serious gains in Zaporizhzhia during the fall. The assault on Mala Tokmachka likely plays a role in this adjusted strategy, as it's the sort of settlement that Russia could use as a staging ground for future assaults or a base for its drone operators as they attempt to attack the rest of the Zaporizhzhia region. Russian forces will now seek to improve their tactical position in Zaporizhzhia Oblast to prevent Ukrainian defenders from transferring reserves to other, more active fronts and for terrorist purposes, such as moving closer to the regional capital to strike it with guided aerial bombs, KABs, the outlet said at the time. These terror tactics are supposed to give the impression that Russia is winning, the Moscow Times reported on October 21st. Putin is still pushing for Ukraine to cede territory, even as his forces fail to capture that territory. Russia's leader is so detached from the reality of what's happening on the ground, the Moscow Times says, that he even claimed that Ukrainian forces were retreating across the entire line of contact on October 7th. That isn't happening. Either Putin doesn't know this isn't happening, or those closest to him are lying. That offers even more context for the assault on Mala Tokmachka. Russia may have thrown so much of its armor at the village because it's trying to turn Putin's delusions into a reality, before Putin finds out what he says doesn't match the situation on the ground. Right now, the Moscow Times says Russia is concentrating its military units in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk for what Putin believes will be a final assault on Donbass. Advancing in Zaporizhzhia will allow Russia to send troops across the border into the Donbass, which is why Putin is targeting the region. Russia's problem is that its current rate of advance suggests that this so-called final assault could require years of fighting before the Donbass ultimately falls. As for Ukraine, it will continue doing what it did on October 20th. The defense of Tokmachka shows that Ukraine knows exactly how Russia is going to attack, and that it's prepared for the relaunched mechanized assaults Russia is using now. Russia will keep hitting anything it can, from military targets to civilian infrastructure, as it attempts to create the impression of an advance in Zaporizhzhia. All Ukraine has to do is continue defending like it did in Tokmachka, providing evidence via video footage along the way, and Putin's narrative of an inevitable Russian victory will come unstuck. Despite all of these failures, Russia will continue to push in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia because Putin is utterly obsessed with claiming Donbass. In our video, we reveal the true reasons that Putin is so hell-bent on claiming this region of Ukraine and what his obsession has meant for Russia and its military. Check out the video to learn more, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for videos covering Ukraine's latest military successes against Russia. And thank you, as always, for watching.